Welcome in, folks. You are here for Healing Equity United's free webinar on the Supreme Court, systemic oppression, and whiteness. Welcome into the space. We're going to get started with a land acknowledgement. So we'd like to start off today by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today, even though we are meeting in a virtual space. Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwakma Ohlone, Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territory lands. We would like to take a moment to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since even before the US was formed as a nation. While the numbers vary, in 1492, there were approximately 100 million Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas already living here. Today, there are 6.8 million Indigenous peoples in the US and 574 federally recognized tribes. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systemic destruction of their communities and culture. This continues through present day. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and present and consider how we can, each in our own way, try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. And thank you. To help you in looking up the land that you are on, we'd love for you to acknowledge that into the chat. I'm going to drop a link if you need some assistance in finding the land that you're on. And once you do, feel free to acknowledge the lands that you are calling in from.
Thank you, Cassie. And we would also like to offer a sincere welcome into this space. And thank you for sharing this space with us by sharing our diversity statement. So we welcome into this space people of all genders. This may include people who identify as women, men, trans, genderqueer, or others. We welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islander, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, people of mixed or multiple descents. We welcome the languages that might be spoken by all of you: Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people of different class backgrounds: working class, middle class, owning class, those who aren't sure where they might fit on the class spectrum. We welcome people who are currently struggling to get access to resources necessary for survival, like housing, healthcare, reliable transportation, childcare, and those who currently have more access to those resources. We welcome into the space people with disabilities, visible or invisible, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We welcome your bodies and the different ways that you experience yours. That might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome those who identify as activists and those who do not. The single, the married, the partnered, the dating, those in monogamous relationships, those in polyamorous relationships. We welcome those who are sexually active and those who are not. Those who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. We welcome your emotions, joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment, you name it. We welcome those who support your ability to be in community with us. That might include your family's genetic or otherwise. We welcome people with different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. We welcome our elders, those who are in community with us now, or those who have been in our lives in a private capacity. And finally, we welcome people who have been in these workshops or workshops similar to these and those who have not. So sincerely, sincerely from HEU to you, welcome. So we're going to take a little time to introduce ourselves and then launch right into the content. So I'm Fiona Audra Oliphant. I am a Jamaican American, first generation. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to being naturalized citizens. So being mindful of the oppression that immigrants face in this community and then leveraging my identity to be in solidarity with them has always been very crucial to me. I am an American citizen, and so that's one of the identities that I leverage in order to be in solidarity with immigrant folks. Underneath the American flag, you'll see scales of justice. I'm an attorney barred in New York and DC. And so in some spaces, that identity grants my voice greater value and access than in other spaces or otherwise. I'm a native New Yorker from the South Bronx, a community that's primarily Black and brown, higher rates of poverty, higher rates of drug use, higher rates of crime, and higher rates of love and support. And finally, for these purposes, I am married to an cisgender immigrant from Europe who identifies as male. We have 3 children, half Black, half white. My eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cassie White-Verdes, she, her pronouns. I'll also share some of the identities that I come into the space with that informs how I do work. I identify as a second generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial, as I have a white father. I'm a first gen college student. I went to school in Delaware and then went to grad school in Philadelphia, and that's where I taught. I used to be a middle school science teacher, and I identify as an educator through and through. Currently, I live in Seattle, Washington with my partner and our dog, who's pictured there. And I also wear the hat as an education director for a small nonprofit called Seattle Works.
Hi, my name is Jess, and I am currently based in Oakland, California. I am a first generation immigrant. I came to the US when I was about 4 years old from Hong Kong because my parents were afraid of what would happen when Hong Kong was handed back over to China in the 1990s. I grew up in New York City as a child of blue collar workers. My mom was a seamstress. My dad worked overnight cleaning the commercial kitchens of restaurants in New York City. I was the first in my family to learn English. And that meant that I became the de facto interpreter and translator for both of my parents. And that's a role that I still play to this day. I have a partner who's pictured here. He's a community organizer in Oakland, Chinatown, and we have 2 dogs, one of whom is my service animal and the other of whom is a lot cuter than he really is. And so that's a little bit about me. I also want to tell you a little bit about Healing Equity United. So we are a women-owned consulting firm. Fiona and I started it in 2018 after spending decades in the nonprofit sector and realizing that oftentimes when we were in different spaces, including coalition spaces, we were often the only people of color, women of color in those spaces. And there are very few people in leadership positions, people holding power in the nonprofit sector who reflected the services and communities that we are working with. And so our mission is really to foster equity, diversity, and inclusion by compelling individuals to examine our own power and privileges and understanding how we leverage that in support of communities that have been oppressed. Some of the work that we do include equity audits. We also do consulting directly with nonprofit organizations and series of workshops and trainings. So our goals for today are we're going to recognize how the Supreme Court's decisions on Roe, gun control, and prayer are intricately connected to systemic oppression. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of what's been happening with the court, and we want to provide some space for us to talk about and to think about and brainstorm what we can do today as allies and as co-conspirators. And how do we really sustain ourselves in this fight? Because we know that this form of oppression happening in our justice system is not necessarily going to end. It hasn't ended, it may not end this year, but we will be getting to that. And we want to figure out, how do we sustain ourselves through self-care and through community care as well.
Thank you, Jess. And even though we're meeting in a webinar format, we wanted to share some group agreements that we wanted to bring into this space to help hold the space. From our perspective in how we do the work, we ask folks to remain in a posturing of no oppression Olympics, right? So we come from a space of all types of manifestations of oppression are tied and our liberation is tied. So it doesn't behoove us to be stuck in a space of oppression Olympics. Want folks to be brave in this space. We're going to be calling on you to put some, information and feedback in the chat. We're going to ask you to participate in Mentimeters and to really, be collaborative thought partners with us as we move through our time together. So please be brave. If you're going to be typing in the chat, if you're going to be typing in Mentimeter, feel free to say it messy. Type it messy. Right? We're not gonna, be stuck on wanting to craft the most perfect message. If we did that, we wouldn't have enough time to be in solidarity and community with each other. So type it messy, say it messy, and take care of yourself. If there are any additional group agreements that would help you to participate or hear what we're sharing in a more transparent and authentic way, please put those in the chat as well, and we will acknowledge them. Cassie?
Thanks, Fiona. And so some of our technical agreements that we'd love for you all to also agree with, please use the Q&A function to post your questions so that we can keep track of them. Feel free to use the chat to communicate with us, with each other. Apologies, we did not realize that it was disabled at the beginning. It should be available to you now. I see a couple of you honoring the lands that you are on. Continue to do that. And if you have a reactions button that shows up at the bottom of your screen, feel free to use that as well during the presentation. And if there are any other technical agreements that would you'd love to see for the space today, feel free to message us as well.
So let's go ahead and get started. And so I wanted to start off with this poem by Langston Hughes. And I'm going to read it for accessibility reasons. Not me alone, I know now, but all the whole oppressed, poor world, white and black, must put their hands with mine to shake the pillars of those temples wherein the false gods dwell, and worn out altars stand too well defended, and the rule of greeds upheld that must be ended. We wanted to start off with that because it's really important that we understand that a big portion of the work that we do is to recognize that we have to shake the pillars of those temples that guard for us the policies and practices of how things work, the systems in which we are forced to work. And so let me take a step back and actually start off with just a definition of oppression, just to make sure we are all on the same page. And the definition of oppression that I'm going to share with you is actually from Rita Hardiman, Bailey Jackson, and Pat Griffin through their Conceptual Foundations for Social Justice Education book. And it says, a system that maintains advantage and disadvantage based on social group membership and operates intentionally and unintentionally on individual, institutional, and cultural levels. So we can't fully grasp the scope of oppression if we evaluate it exclusively through the lens of individual experiences. In order for us to do that, we have to use a helicopter view to understand and examine the interactions of social groups. So oppression is something that affects everyone, and we know all forms of oppression are interconnected. Oppression sets the norm for where how things are supposed to be. And on some level, all of us have been socialized to accept some systems of oppression as normal. Characteristics of oppression can include being omnipresent. So oppression permeates most and shapes most aspects of our society. It's confining. So oppression restricts one's ability to pursue and achieve goals and aspirations. So let's think about it as a series of hurdles in a race. They aren't impossible to overcome. However, they do impose an impediment to running as quickly as others who don't have any hurdles in front of them. Oppression is also hierarchical. It's based on the notion that one group is dominant to another. And in that relationship, one group receives benefits at the expense of another group. And it is multifaceted. It's complicated, it's nuanced, and cuts across various social groups. So you'll see on the screen in front of you the different forms of oppression that are listed here. And this list is not comprehensive. We know that the manifestations of oppression can change and evolve over time. So if we were to take the case of racism, racism in and of itself has worn many faces over the years. It's been called enslavement, Jim Crow, burnt crosses, the white hoods of the KKK. And we know that racism today looks a little bit different. And so impact of oppression, people who've been impacted by oppression might not feel safe to fully share their stories. They may not feel completely understood. They might not receive the full scope of needed services, fear of engaging different systems. They might feel shut down. And I just want to ask you all to share in the chat other manifestations of oppression that you can think of. So what are some of the other manifestations of oppression or forms of oppression that you can think of? And so, as you all are sharing in the chat, I'll read it out loud because just for psychological safety reasons, the chat is primarily only being seen by hosts and panelists. So I have sizeism, reproductive rights restriction, intimate partner violence. So with intimate partner violence, if we can think a little bit more about the survivor of intimate partner violence, what might be some of the forms of oppression that they might face in accessing services? Someone else mentioned religious oppression, issues with housing and access to affordable and quality housing. Yes, people with different forms of oppression can face issues with housing, but what is it about their social identity that might lend itself to having issues with housing? Some of the ones that are listed here already are classism, sexism, ableism, heterosexism. What other forms can you think of, Fiona or Cassie, that are not here? And oh, I just saw another one came in that says educational, elitism, religion, beliefs, spiritualities, homophobia, transphobia. What else can you think of, Fiona and Cassie?
Yeah, autism for folks who may not be able to hear or may be deaf of hard of hearing. Let's see. I saw another one that came in that was in reference to being undocumented and colorism. Cassie?
Yeah, the big one that I was going to name was colorism.
Great, thank you. And so I'm going to turn it over to Fiona now to talk a little bit more about the Supreme Court.
Thanks, Jess. And so thank you for laying that foundation, right? We wanted to have a conversation around how systemic oppression is showing up in the Supreme Court and these recent decisions, but we can't have that conversation unless we first have a very fundamental conversation around what systemic oppression is, what it looks like, the varied forms that it can take. And so just wanted to start with a snapshot of the Supreme Court, because we know that the Supreme Court has been in existence since 1789. right? There have been 116 justices, right? And all but 8, let me repeat that, all but 8 of the 116 justices that we've had on the Supreme Court have been white men, right? We know that the first Black justice, Thurgood Marshall, was appointed in 1967. The first female justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, was appointed in 1981. First Latina, Sonia Sotomayor, was in 2009. And the first Black woman, Ketanji Brown Jackson, in 2022, right? And so we start with a conversation of providing this snapshot because we know that the way the law is made, the way that history is shared, is really rooted in and reflective of white maleness, white male supremacy, power hoarding, right? And the lived experiences of those 108 justices who were white men, who were, primarily upper educated, wealthy, right? Who had a certain set of lived experiences that helped to formulate their decision-making, right? Their judicial opinions, right? So when we think back, and I think that there's some of you who work in the domestic violence, sexual assault space, there's a common colloquial term called the rule of thumb, right? And justices, lawyers, judges, all referred to the rule of thumb, the rule of thumb. Well, all of them were men. And that rule of thumb actually referenced you couldn't abuse or hit your wife with an instrument that was thicker than your thumb, than the width of your thumb, right? That was their lived experience. That's how they came up with that term. That's how they came up with the law and decisions that they made. So I make reference to that by saying, given the history of composition of the justices and Supreme Court that we've had, it makes sense that our legal decisions are rooted in systemic oppression, in uplifting whiteness and white supremacy. Can we go to the next one? So on their face, these recent decisions regarding, overturning Roe, separation of church and state, and gun safety or restrictions might seem disparate. They might seem like they don't have anything in common with each other. And we like to argue that that helps to further silo all of our resistance, our forms of resistance, right? Because we say, oh, we have those who want to protect abortion rights over here. And they're gonna do their work. They're gonna do their advocacy. They're gonna fight for liberation in that space. And then we're gonna have, the folks who are advocating for gun safety and more restrictions over here in that silo. But the whole point of systemic oppression, as we're gonna get to, is to have us pitted against each other, to have us purposefully not work in conjunction and collaboration with each other so that we don't get further. So let me just give you a quick rundown of some of these cases. I'm not gonna bore you because Jess and Cassie will yell at me if I tell you too much about these cases and the legal backdrop. But so the overturning of Roe v. Wade stemmed from the Dobbs v. Jackson case. The underlying case was regarding a Mississippi law that prohibited abortion after the 15th week of pregnancy. The gun regulation and safety case was the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin. And that case overturned a long-standing New York State law regarding a proper cause requirement to carry a concealed weapon throughout the state. In terms of church separation of church and state, there have been a series of Supreme Court decisions, but the most famous of those decisions came out of the decision regarding a white male public school coach who prayed on the field after games. And so why, let's see, and I'm getting some questions in here. And why does it seem like all of these cases are disparate? We argue that they're all manifestations of the same thing. They are all manifestations of what Jess referred to as systemic oppression. One, in terms of a group of folks telling women what they can do with their bodies, right? How they can control their bodies. The other being that we get to tell you that you have to pray in these public spaces the same way we are. And that is created by the dominant norm. I mentioned that the person who advanced the Supreme Court case was a white Christian male. I don't know whether or not the decision would have been the same if it had been a Sikh or if it had been a Muslim person, right? The manifestation of, there's a joke that Jess and I and Cassie have had, the quickest way to promote gun safety and regulations is to advocate for all folks of the global majority, people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to start buying guns and start upholding their Second Amendment rights. And we will quickly find that there are some gun safety regulations that are put in there. So from our perspective, these are all manifestations of the same thing. And I'm just going to quickly pause to ask Jess or Cassie, are there any questions that I should be pausing to address right now? Anything in the chat? Okay. All right. So we wanted to move on to really further explaining how all of these court decisions are, and the Supreme Court in and of itself, its composition, are really rooted in systemic oppression, and why we have to come together to collaboratively interrupt and dismantle systemic oppression. So from our perspective, systemic oppression is a house that's built on a variety of factors, right? That we all collude in, right? The scarcity model or mindset, right? The idea that I can only fight for abortion rights because there's only so much advocacy we can do at one time. I can't fight for the separation of church and state. I can't fight for, more gun safety laws. I can't fight for the protection of privacy decisions in terms of who can marry whom, interracial marriage, LGBTQIA2 spirit marriage, right? I can't advocate for all of those things at the same time because there's only so much of the pie available. We have to get rid of that scarcity model, that scarcity mindset, right? Fear. Fear is a huge component of what allows systemic oppression to thrive. If I attack the current system, they're going to come after me. They're going to come after my funding. They're going to come after my reputation. They're going to come after my ability to advance in my career, right? And when I say my and I, it can be us as individuals or us as organizations, right? Or us as communities, right? So there is a huge component of fear that if we strive to really rock the system, that it's going to boomerang on us and hurt us, right? Push us back. Individualism. We know that individualism is a crucial component of systemic oppression and its varied manifestations, right? There is no way that we can dismantle this house that you see on the screen alone. We can only do it in solidarity and community with each other. Invisibility. When we don't know that there are other communities out there that are being impacted similarly to our communities by systemic oppression, we remain fractured. We have to uplift our stories. When Jess was talking about the impact of oppression, right? We have to shout it from the rooftops, right? In order to get more and more folks aware of how systemic oppression is impacting a variety of different communities and spaces in order to come together. Power hoarding, I think that one is obvious, right? I want to hold on to my little piece of power, right? Therefore, I'm not going to I'm not going to try to disrupt systemic oppressions or systems of oppression. Superiority. Now, this one is a tricky one in that systemic oppression is rooted in hierarchical approaches, right? So for those at the top to benefit most, you have to believe that there are those at the bottom, and those at the bottom are inherently inferior to you. We have to ask ourselves, how are we complicit in that, right? So when we looked at the marches after the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade, some folks asked, where were you people when such and such decision came out? Where were you people when we were arguing about this and that? Okay, we have to acknowledge that all of these forms of oppression are tied, and it's not just when it impacts you, right? It's also important when it's impacting those who are at the bottom of that hierarchical structure that helps to maintain systemic oppression. And the last three I'll go through quickly because we want to get to the collaborative piece where we brainstorm. Fatigue. Some of us are tired, y'all, and it's on purpose. We are being attacked on a variety of different frontiers, right? And, you know, we are tired of marching. We are tired of, fighting for different legislation. We are tired of advocating. We are tired of writing blog posts. We're tired, right? But from my perspective, it's on purpose. We are purposefully being exhausted so that we cannot effectively counter this onslaught of oppressive decisions and the like. Us versus them, I think I referenced that a bit, right? We can't have this, I can't address anybody else's oppression until I address my own, right? We have to address all of them at the same time. So as a Black woman, I can't think about Asian hate right now because I'm focused on anti-Blackness. What I would love to do is have both communities come together, right? To break it down. All right, and we can't be complacent. We can't rest on our laurels in this process. Next one. So what does whiteness have to do with all of this? Because we mentioned that in the name of the webinar. And from our perspective, it's three very basic components, right? So, you know, when I talked about the makeup of the Supreme Court and 108 of the justices being white men versus 8 others, white men have to hold other white men accountable, have to be willing to share power, have to be willing to share resources, and have to overcome their fear that by doing so, they might lose something in terms of esteem. They might lose their job. They might lose access to certain spaces. They might be losing some of their social network, right? So that's one way that we say whiteness is really crucial to this. Another component is white women, right? So we saw in the 2016 election, the white women overwhelmingly voted a certain way. And it was fairly well known that that decision was in direct contradiction to other people's rights, to other people's freedom, to other people's liberation. And so white women have to hold white women accountable in this process, right? As we move towards solidarity. And then finally, for those who identify as members of the global majority, we have to have some honest conversations about our desire to maintain proximity to whiteness. And when I say that proximity to whiteness, I'm really talking about not whiteness as in terms of skin color, but whiteness in terms of access to resources, right? Access to power, right? So this is not just one person's issue. When we talk about whiteness, it's actually all of our issue. That's how we think that whiteness plays into some of these recent decisions, the makeup of the Supreme Court, how power is held in this society. Now, we wanted to show you a brief clip, and I'm going to set up this clip before we play it. Now, some of you have recently heard of an exchange between Professor Bridges and Senator Hawley. Now, we're going to play this clip, and what we would love for you all to do is to share in the chat, and we'll read it out, some of the dynamics and some of the systemic oppression that we've just been talking about in this exchange. We're not talking about the political, we're not talking about Democrat versus Republican, we're not talking about that. We're just talking about the systemic oppression dynamics that are going to be visible in this exchange. Cassie?
Thank you to all of our witnesses, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Coons. We're voting on the floor, so we're trying to do both things. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. I want to visit with you, Ms. Meskey, but before I do, I just want to clear one thing up. Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing them.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the folks who can have pregnancies?
So I want to note that 1 out of 5 transgender persons have attempted suicide. So I think it's important
Because of
for
my
us-
line of questioning? So
Because-
we can't talk about it?
because denying that trans people exist and pretending not to know that they exist
I'm
is
denying that trans
dangerous.
people exist by
Are
asking
you?
you if you're
Are
talking
you?
about women
Are you?
having pregnancies?
Do you believe that men can get pregnant?
No, I don't think women can
So
get
you are
pregnant.
denying that trans people exist?
And that leads to violence? Is this how you run your classroom? Are students allowed to question you? Or are
Absolutely.
they also treated like this, where
No, no, no,
they're
they're
told
allowed
that
to
they're
question.
opening up people to
Oh,
violence
we have a good
by
time in my
questioning?
class. You should join.
I bet.
You might learn a lot.
Wow, I would learn a lot. I've learned a lot
I
just in this
know,
exchange.
absolutely.
Extraordinary.
Yep.
Ms. Matsky, let me ask you something.
All right, thank you. And Cassie put into the chat for everyone, which systemic oppression dynamics did you notice in that exchange? And again, we are, and I see from in the chat, lots to take in there. Absolutely, and that's why we're sharing it, right? So we want to hear from you. What's coming up for you when you see that exchange? All right, so I'm seeing transphobia, toxic masculinity, intimidation, condescending speech, gaslighting. Oh, wow, this is a lot coming in. Okay. Sexism, that's right. White privilege, superiority, racism, superiority, fear, scarcity, us versus them, interruption, gaslighting, sexism, or overly emotional heterosexism, just meaning speech, putting down her work. Yes, this is a white man interrupting a Black woman, not letting her speak, while not willing to seek humility. Yes. Questioning her work and ability. All right.
We also see
Yes.
treating her like she's hysterical and defensive.
Yes. Thank you, Jess. I'm sorry that I missed that one. Giving y'all a moment if there's anything else. Yeah, so you all mentioned it. You all got what was happening there. And why I wanted to show this quote is that, I mean, this clip rather, is that this exchange has often been framed as exclusively about trans rights or exclusively about abortion rights. But in this exchange, we can see quite clearly that there is so much more here, and it's interconnected. As some of you all mentioned, there are the gender dynamics. There are the racial dynamics. There are the dynamics in terms of societal power and positional power. Yes, she's a professor at a prestigious school, but he's a senator. And he's using his role as a senator to interrupt, right? To condescend, to sort of manipulate, to gaslight. You all were mentioning it, but again, that's why we are sharing this clip, so that we don't fall into this trap of these issues being siloed. We have to be able for ourselves to identify the interconnected nature of all of this, so that we can then move to dismantle systemic oppression collectively. So I'm going to now turn it over to Jess to help lead us in that process.
So we need to talk about why we have to move beyond allyship in a society that's so deeply steeped in systemic oppression. And to begin that process, we want to first start by just understanding what allyship is and what does moving beyond it mean. And so we have a definition for allyship, which is an active, consistent, arduous practice of unlearning and re-evaluating, in which we recognize the power and privilege that we hold, and we seek to be in solidarity with a marginalized group. That's definition from the Anti-Oppression Network. But what we're saying is that allyship, while it's okay, is not going to get us there in the end. And what we need to begin to do is to move and shift towards co-conspiratorship, which in some areas, sometimes it's also called accomplice. But we use it as co-conspiratorship, Healing Equity United. And co-conspiratorship, according to Alicia Garza, means that we're showing up in ways beyond posting the obligatory Facebook post. We're showing up in ways that leverage the power and privilege we hold towards supporting the on-the-ground leadership. And that we are showing up in ways that demonstrate a commitment to the movement. And even if that might mean that we risk our social status, our livelihood, or our life. And so I want to talk a little bit about co-conspiratorship more, because I think there's a lot of examples of what might be, and then there's a lot of judgments as to whether things can be an allyship action or co-conspirator action or none of the above, right? And so some of you might have heard about, I think it was a few years ago when people posted those black squares on Instagram, or change their profile pictures on Facebook to be a black square to show that they were in alignment with the movement. And while that might be a good act of allyship, the question is, does it actually challenge existing systems, right? Right after Roe happened, I had a couple of people in my neighborhood who wanted to put up something in their yard, just kind of recreating the Handmaid's Tale scenario. And she was asking, does anyone have poster board or red tablecloths, right? And we're not judging it. We're just, the question is, does that lead to changing and dismantling white supremacy, white power, to interrupting systemic oppression, right? Another action of allyship might be, during the protests of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, people were purchasing Black Lives Matter lawn signs and putting up on their lawns, right? The question again is really, what is that challenge? But then the second question is really thinking about what risk is there for the individual who is putting up those signs. So I will tell you that for me, I organized my entire block to purchase signs from a Black-owned sign making company. We distributed it, we put it on our lawns. It was a show of solidarity. For me, it was really unifying my white neighbors on the block, and getting them to really be thinking about these issues, but there was no risk to me. Fiona and I have met individuals who have done exactly the same thing. And what happened for them is that they had their tires slashed. Anyone who put up that sign had their tires slashed. They were warned that if they kept that up, they will continue other acts of violence against their property or their vehicles. They kept those signs up anyway. That's an act of co-conspiratorship because we are taking a risk, right? So I think it's important for us to think about how, Dr. Bettina Love talks about this in her TED Talk and also in her book, We Want to Do More Than Survive, in that the Underground Railroad was not an act of allyship. It was an act of co-conspiratorship. Because the people who were helping enslaved folks get to the North, get to Canada, were all taking a risk. If someone came and knocked on your door and found that you had an enslaved person in the South, you yourself could be lynched for supporting that individual. Your family, your kids could be murdered for supporting them, right? But people did it anyway. And so for us, we have to really be thinking beyond allyship to where we might sit in co-conspiratorship. And I know that whenever Fiona, Cassie, and I talk about this, there's a lot of questions around it. Like, well, what's going to happen? I can't leave my job. I have kids. And the thing is, we're asking you to think about where in your life you might be able to be a co-conspirator. We're not saying you have to do all of it every single day, all the time, right? There are actions that I can't take because there would be risk to my life. There are actions that Fiona can't take because there might be risk to her kids. There are actions that Cassie can't take because it might mean that it might affect her career and her ability to pay her bills, right? So we're not judging our actions. We're just simply thinking about what can we actually do. And so the question that we have for you all now is, what can we do collaboratively as co-conspirators? And so Cassie's going to put a link in the chat. We want to do some collective brainstorming using Mentimeter. And so if you click on the link in the chat, it should open up in a browser for you. And we're just going to have you just share what are some of the things that you might be able to do as co-conspirators. And so you can submit multiple answers, ideas. We'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. And then once we have a good number of responses, we'll share with you what others are thinking.
All right, we see a few answers coming in. I'm gonna highlight just a few, read them aloud for accessibility purposes. Participate in local elections, put yourself on the front line, join a nonprofit board, create mutual aid communities, pull over and be a witness when a POC is pulled over by the police, keep our congresspersons accountable, call them, email them, get your message out, use positions of power and privilege to correct and educate others, put the needs of Black people before your own, be present when injustice is happening, express disagreement in a nonviolent way, promote and elevate individuals from the global majority, speak up even when it's with family, coworkers, etc. Work to dismantle systemic structures from within. Don't be a silent witness. Right? Silence is compliance. Hire people of the global majority. Teach kiddos to strive to be anti-racist by pointing out racism in the media and in person. Recognize personal expertise in addition to professional expertise. What I'm hearing there is recognizing lived experience. Integrate anti-racism into all educational programs. Jess or Fiona, I'm curious if you have any prompts for folks to think about in terms of what they're thinking of for acts of co-conspiratorship.
So I'm going to challenge you all to go a little bit further. So when we say be vocal, be intentional, can we be more specific about what that means?
Thanks, Jess. Seeing a couple more come in. Thanks just for that prompt again, right? Let's think a bit deeper than speaking up, using your voice. What do you mean by that? I see question and challenge white supremacist values when you notice them. Answer kids' questions honestly and openly instead of making it a hush-hush topic. I'm curious for this one right here, discuss intersectionality. What risks are we taking by discussing intersectionality? Let's dive a little deeper into that. What else are y'all thinking of? In terms of folks who have put in notes about answering kids' questions, what do you mean by that? What kinds of questions? Can we dive a little deeper into that? All right, we're seeing a couple other suggestions coming in here. Challenge your own anti-Blackness. Work to review and change agency policies that promote white institutional values that harm us and our community. What else? What are you putting on the line? What are you risking in being a co-conspirator? All right. Let's see. Risk your privilege and comfort to uplift others. While voting, I went through the pamphlet with my kid and pointed out key phrases that show the person is racist, aggressive prison policies, war against drugs, and how those harm people of color due to historical laws in place. Placing my body between cops and Black and brown protesters at BLM marches and rallies, that's definitely putting on the risk, right? That is within co-conspirator, that is taking action. That is not just allyship. For nonprofits, you may appear to be going outside of your quote unquote mission. Risk support for certain supporters, donors, funders, right? If you're sticking to your anti-racist values, that means you're not falling in line with those white dominant norms, those white supremacist cultural values. And you should be sticking to that even when having conversations with funders. Let BIPOC folks lead. What else? Again, I think we're trying to encourage you all to think beyond that allyship piece, right? Like what would you be putting on the line in your day-to-day? What would you be risking in your day-to-day to move towards co-conspiratorship? Fiona and Jess, anything you want to add to this activity?
Thank you, Cassie, for the opportunity. Yeah. You know, sometimes it's challenging for folks to, in the moment, in the spur of the moment, come up with varied ways that we can be co-conspirators. And so we're probably going to leave you with some suggestions on how you can spur creativity and how you might reimagine what it might look like for you to be a co-conspirator. We're hearing and seeing some great starts and some great suggestions on how to start this process. But yeah, we, you know, as a group, we want to be able to push it one step further, because I'm gonna be honest, y'all, those seeking to further entrench systems of oppression are being strategic, are being committed, are being diligent, are being persistent, are being farsighted. Right? And we are a little bit behind the 8 ball in this process. And so what you hear from Cassie's questions of asking you to dig a little deeper, do a little more, that's what we're up against. That's where the work is. And so I understand that, I understand it's hard to do it in the moment. Did you want to add anything, Jess?
I'd be happy to add just an example from my own work, an active co-conspiratorship from a previous job that might spark folks into thinking about how they can leverage their power and privilege. I worked with a BIPOC identifying colleague who regularly experienced microaggressions and blatant racism from not only her supervisor, but our executive director. And while she was in a place of feeling like her job was at risk in naming that, I stepped in and named it for her. I consulted with her. Hey, I'm noticing that this is happening. I'm seeing that it's impacting you. How can I show up for you? And she was comfortable with me being the one to address it. And so I was actually someone who asked for that time with my executive director to call that out. And in the end, her supervisor was fired for her racist behavior towards this person. And so that was me putting my own, job on the line, right? I very well could have also been fired, or something could have happened to me, retaliation could have happened to me, and that, but I was putting that risk on the line for my colleague.
Thank you, Kathy. That's a great example. Yeah. And talk about being brave, right? Like this effort, this collaborative co-conspiracy requires bravery. All right. Let's reshare screen. All right, so we just wanted to leave this with you all to consider as we open it up to further questions. We want to make sure that you have time to share your questions and thoughts with us. So we're asking folks to reflect on the ways that you as an individual, not your neighbor, not your cousin, not your uncle, you as an individual, right, might be complicit in any of the systems of oppression that we talked about, right? And then to act, to take the time, once you've identified how you might be complicit, to leverage your power and privilege to disrupt, overturn, just tear down these systems. then to be mindful of what might be working against you in this process so that you might mitigate it all. So I'm going to stop there so that we can open it up for questions. Jess has already put in the chat, we want to hear from you, and then we'll tell you what HEU can do to help support you in your process and your organization, and then close you out.
So we received a question about, speaking of strategic long-term planning, I'm learning that groups like the National Right to Life funnel millions into campaigns, politicians, and judges. Is there an equal and opposite effort? So I can start by actually talking about how after the Roe opinions were published, we specifically heard that there were a lot of people engaging in rage philanthropy or rage giving. And what that was essentially individuals donating more than they have before, and a lot higher in terms of dollar amounts, even in the economy that we're in, towards organizations that were basically working on the opposite side. And so that was one that may not have made the news in that way, but I do think that that was definitely something that we were seeing in philanthropy and in terms of individual communities as well.
Thanks, Jess. Anything to add to that, Fiona? Okay. We have another question in the Q&A. Can you speak about the audits that Healing Equity United performs?
Thank you for the question. We do anti-oppression and racial equity, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging audits and assessments. The way we typically do it is to have an organizational assessment accompanied by individual assessments. The organizational assessments review existing policies, practices, procedures, board composition, who's in leadership, what's the culture of the organization, what are the underlying values, and how are values and commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and how are they conveyed internally to staff and your community, and how are they relayed externally, and how are they backed up by action. So that's a very substantive assessment. The individual assessment is surrounding any important resource for an organization or people, right? So we want to know where people are in their individual journeys. We ask a variety of questions around that so that organizations can then be able to determine what kind of supplemental resources might be necessary to support staff or to support board members on their journeys. Our assessments are completely anonymous. They're followed up by a report with recommendations and a processing retreat. Jess or Cassie, would you like to add anything to that response?
Thanks, Fiona. I'm just going to drop a link in the chat if you want to learn more or you'd like to get in contact with us. There's a link there. Another question that we had come into the chat: what can complicity look like?
Complicity is very often silence. I'll give a couple of examples in nonprofit spaces. When staff of the global majority, who identifies the global majority, are trying to shift and push existing power structures and are subsequently relegated to the sidelines are castigated, are fired, are deemed to be the squeaky wheel, are blackballed, right? Silence in light of that, that's complicity. As nonprofit organizations saying, you know, we're gonna compete with another nonprofit organization so we can't collaboratively co-fund opportunities. That's complicity, right? Like, especially if those other lesser resourced nonprofits are culturally specific or led by BIPOC leadership, like that's complicity. There are a whole variety of other ways to be complicit. Jess and Cassie, you wanna jump in on any of those?
Yeah, I think someone mentioned this earlier. But if your organization, if you or your organization are shifting your values to meet white funders or white stakeholders where they're at, that is complicity, right? Like, you are not sticking to your commitment to your own anti-racist values because you're needing to conform to meet the needs of a white funder, right? That's also an example of complicity. All right, anything from you, Jess? Okay. We had another question. What specific actions can a white person do to give more power to BIPOC identifying folks? Fiona or Jess?
Well, I would say share power, not give power. We all have power. It's about how comfortable we are in sharing power, how comfortable we are in acknowledging other folks' or communities' power. But I would say some very specific examples might include if you're invited to speak as an expert on a panel, right? But you know that there are some folks of the global majority who are doing some really great grassroots work in that space. Say, you know, thank you for inviting me. I don't think I'm the right person to participate, but you should really get in touch with, be specific, name that person, because they are doing the work, their work should be uplifted. They should be recognized for the work that they're doing, right? That's sharing power. Sharing power might be, you know what? Actually, I'm not gonna throw my name in the ring for this position because I think XYZ person who identifies with a marginalized community is qualified to do the work, should be taking a greater role, should be shifted into leadership. That's sharing power. Those are just a couple of specific examples for me. Jess or Cassie?
Yeah, I think that one of the things to think about is if you are asking for a BIPOC individual to share their expertise or their lived experience in a professional or official way, whether it's at their training or you're having them come and sit on a board and provide feedback or guidance on programming, I think it's important that we think about compensating them for that level of expertise.
Thank you both. It looks like this is a follow-up question to the assessments that we work on at Healing Equity United with our clients. This question says, do you have specific tools that you use that provide qualitative and quantitative results? Are focus groups included?
Yeah, we've created some tools, online tools, adapted some tools. We have some focus groups that we sometimes use, but we're very mindful of dynamics of societal power and positional power when we're having focus groups, so that people's narratives and feedback don't impact or sway other participants. What am I missing, Jess?
Well, it's very customizable to each organization that we're working with. And so depending on the organization, the people who are involved in some organizations we work with, we include active volunteers as well as clients. So I think it just depends on the organization that we're working with for those assessments.
Looks like we have another question. Any words or advice on having to work with law enforcement or governmental offices that are oppressive?
A great question, because we recognize that this work requires a certain level of flying the plane, dismantling the plane, reimagining the plane, engineering the plane, and creating a new plane all at the same time. We know that nonprofit organizations exist within a systemically oppressive framework. We recognize this, but there are a variety of different ways that we can push back, work in conjunction with. I'm not the type to say you don't work with law enforcement. Well, I'm the type to say that, and as long as they're open to conversation, let's have that conversation. And so we can meet people where they are at today with the hopes of shifting them to where we would like them to be tomorrow. So some suggestions might be to really be mindful about whether or not we're calling people out while thinking that we're calling people in. Calling people in isn't an invitation to a prolonged conversation, a mutual created understanding, and a foundation to build off of. Calling people out, it's like, I tried, I'm done with you, next, right? It's really shutting things down. So that would be my one really concrete example.
I also want to mention that we often think about law enforcement or government or certain government offices being totally on one side. And I think it's important to remember that, everyone who's there are humans, right? They're individuals. And that even in law enforcement and in governmental offices, there are individuals who are working, who have similar values as we do, who are trying to work against the systems that they're in. I'll give you, an example. When President Trump came into office, there were folks who were asking people who work for the federal government, like, how can you work for the federal government under this administration? These were people who worked for the US Census. These were people who, worked for Department of Labor, people who've been in their jobs, people who were essentially doing the same jobs that they've had for many years, regardless of who was in power, right? And so, and some of those individuals were still trying to push certain changes through. I mean, Fiona and I were talking with people who refused to use certain words or would say alternative words to what was in the grants for nonprofits, right? Or would structure their, like, trying to go around, some of the more oppressive things that were coming out of the White House. And so I want to say that there are individuals who are allies and co-conspirators, even in those places that we often think of as just giant monoliths, right? Additionally, as someone who has worked in UN peacekeeping, which is heavily made up of people who are in law enforcement, I can tell you that there are, even in law enforcement and even in the domestic violence field itself, there were officers that we worked with that completely supported victims and survivors, who would educate others in their departments, who were the one person that we would call when we needed someone to trust, right? And so I think it's important to think about and recognize who those individuals are, so that they are our way in terms of calling folks in or calling on folks, in terms of people who want to make those changes.
Yeah, so I want to thank you, Jess, for following up. I also want to acknowledge that Cassie has been great in trying to juggle a lot of the questions that we've been getting in the chat. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer any more, but if we can provide an answer when we follow up with the recording, we'll do so. But I did want to close out with a poem because I know that this is a lot. We touched on the fact that we're all overwhelmed and fatigued. We're being hammered on a bunch of different sides. I also want to share what Healing Equity United can do to support you all. So I'm going to read the poem first and then share what Healing Equity United can do. The poem is a poem that was written by Kamand Kajori, who is a poet, an author, and an educator. And it says, "They want us to be afraid. They want us to be afraid of leaving our homes. They want us to barricade our doors and hide our children. Their aim is to make us fear life itself. They want us to hate. They want us to hate the other. They want us to practice aggression and perfect antagonism. Their aim is to divide us all. They want us to be inhuman. They want us to throw out our kindness. They want us to bury our love and burn our hope. Their aim is to take all our light. They think their bricked walls will separate us. They think their damned bombs will defeat us. They are so ignorant, they don't understand that my soul, your soul, are old friends. They are so ignorant, they don't understand that when they cut you, I bleed. They are so ignorant, they don't understand that we will never be afraid. We will never hate, and we will never be silent, for life is ours. And I wanted to close with that poem because at Healing Equity United, what we really strive to do is to support individuals, communities, and nonprofit organizations to embody the words of that poem. Right? So if that's in terms of, wanting your nonprofit organization to have a set of comprehensive training so that you all can have similar conversations in your space, reach out to us. If that's in terms of being an individual who wants to continue to go on their individual journey in understanding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, reach out to us. If that's in terms of challenging existing systems, in terms of funders or foundations, we're working with them too. Reach out to us because we believe that we are far stronger together than we are separated. And I hope that you gathered that from today's conversation, that these issues that are coming out from the Supreme Court are not disparate. They're all connected. Our oppressions are tied and our liberation is tied. So thank you for taking the time to spend with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.